Chapter 1: Foam Tanks and Rubber Soldiers. Revised. May 1944, Dover, England. The fog rolls off the English Channel thick enough to taste. At a compound hidden behind triple layers of barbed wire and armed guards, Major Norman Cota walks through rows of inflatable tanks that stretch across muddy fields like sleeping metal beasts. Except they're not metal. They're rubber. Rubber and wood and careful geometric calculations designed to deceive an enemy 25 miles across the water. To any untrained eye, the scene would appear absurd. Perfect replicas of American M4 Sherman tanks constructed from materials that would burst like children's balloons under a single artillery shell. But Cota wasn't untrained. As a veteran staff officer who had survived North Africa and Sicily, he understood that deception required more than convincing appearance. It required what German intelligence officers would classify as impossible evidence. The operation that would become Operation Fortitude had been conceived in the spring of 1944 by a team of military strategists who possessed a singular understanding. The Allies could not win a conventional invasion of Normandy if Adolf Hitler believed he possessed the military resources to contain them. But Hitler's intelligence apparatus had been predicting a massive second invasion force, a mythical American army waiting offshore, preparing to strike at Pas-de-Calais, where the English Channel narrowed to its most vulnerable crossing point. The Germans were convinced this army existed. The only problem was that it didn't. In laboratories and warehouses scattered across southern England, a carefully selected team of engineers, set designers, and military personnel were fabricating the most elaborate lie ever constructed on an industrial scale. If executed perfectly, they would convince Nazi Germany to place 15 divisions of combat troops where they could never reach the Normandy beaches. Over 150,000 soldiers frozen in place, waiting for an invasion that would never come. Their absence would allow the genuine D-Day assault to proceed with marginally better odds of survival. The birth of the Ghost Army. The inflatable tanks were the physical foundation of this deception, but they represented only one element of a larger psychological operation that would require fake radio transmissions, false intelligence reports, and the systematic manipulation of German spy networks that had themselves been compromised and turned into unwitting instruments of Allied victory. The concept wasn't new. Military deception had been attempted throughout history, from ancient Trojan horses to Chinese shadow armies. But what made Operation Fortitude unprecedented was its scale and coordination. For the first time in human history, an entire nation's scientific and industrial capacity had been mobilized not to produce weapons, but to create the convincing illusion that weapons existed. The task of constructing the fake army fell to Colonel John Turner, a former Air Ministry engineer who had previously overseen construction of dummy aircraft to mislead German reconnaissance pilots during the Battle of Britain. Turner understood a fundamental principle that would become the foundation of the entire operation. The key to successful deception wasn't perfection in any single element. It was consistency across the entire operational picture. A single dummy tank examined closely by German engineers would betray its rubber construction. But 100 dummy tanks, viewed from aircraft at altitude through cloud cover and haze, would register as a genuine armored formation. Shepperton Studios, the famous British film production facility, became the manufacturing hub for the fake army. The studios that had produced entertainment for British audiences were immediately repurposed for military deception. Set designers, prop masters, and technical specialists who had spent their careers creating illusions for cinema were now enlisted to create a far more consequential illusion. The irony was precise. They had been manufacturing false realities for audiences. Now they would manufacture a false reality for Nazi intelligence. The inflatable tanks were marvels of engineering disguised as toys. Each rubber Sherman was constructed from a fabric covering supported by a network of pressurized rubber tubes that formed what engineers called a pneumatic skeleton. Unlike solid decoys that had been attempted in earlier campaigns, these inflatable versions possessed a critical advantage. They were collapsible, transportable, and could be deployed anywhere Allied commanders needed military presence to be simulated. The dimensions matched genuine M4 Shermans precisely: 26 feet long, 9.5 feet wide, standing 10 feet tall. The profile was indistinguishable from actual armor when observed from distance. Most critically, when viewed from above during German reconnaissance flights or even at ground level through binoculars at range, the rubber tanks possessed the correct silhouette and shadow characteristics that intelligence analysts would expect. Each inflatable tank weighed approximately 93 pounds when empty, light enough that 2 soldiers could position one in minutes. When fully inflated with compressed air from mobile compressors, the structure achieved the weight distribution and ground impression that matched genuine tank tracks. Bulldozers would follow in the wake of deployment, deliberately creating realistic tank track patterns leading to and from the decoy positions. The German reconnaissance pilots wouldn't photograph just tanks. They would photograph evidence of movement, of military activity, of an army preparing for deployment. The architecture of deception, but tanks alone would never convince German intelligence. A genuine military formation required the sprawling apparatus of organized warfare. At facilities outside the town of Folkestone, canvas and wood structures were being erected with mathematical precision. Division headquarters that would appear authentic from 20,000 feet. Supply depots arranged in patterns that matched actual divisional organization. Motor pools assembled from wooden frames and painted canvas, creating the visual appearance of hundreds of vehicles when photographed from above. Anti-aircraft gun positions constructed from plywood and positioned with the kind of geometric precision that military analysts would recognize as authentic defensive doctrine. Officers' quarters, enlisted barracks, medical facilities, ammunition storage areas, every element that a real Army encampment would contain was replicated in whatever materials could be constructed rapidly and convincingly. The builders understood that German reconnaissance pilots weren't just looking for tanks. They were looking for the administrative machinery that would support 400,000 troops preparing for invasion. A fake fuel depot was constructed just along the coast from Dover. Made of wooden boards, scaffolding, and old sewer pipes salvaged from bomb sites, it looked unimpressive from the ground. But from 20,000 feet, viewed through the lens of German reconnaissance cameras, it registered as a critical logistics facility. German intelligence analysts would place it on their maps, calculate storage capacity, estimate how long this fuel depot could support an invasion force. The fact that it was built from trash and imagination never entered their calculations. The artificial docks at Dover became the crown jewel of the physical deception. These were not simple structures. They were full-scale replicas of working amphibious loading facilities, complete with mock landing craft that appeared ready for immediate deployment. The landing craft themselves, codenamed Big Bobs in classified communications, were constructed from canvas and wood stretched over steel frameworks, floating on arrays of 45-gallon oil drums that provided buoyancy. Building each Big Bob required extraordinary labor commitment. Every kit contained over 500 separate parts, filled 6 to 7 3-ton trucks, and demanded 20 men working for 6 hours just to assemble a single craft. When complete, each dummy landing craft weighed 8 tons and looked sufficiently convincing that German reconnaissance pilots would register them as genuine invasion vessels preparing for immediate deployment. The Ghost Army takes form. The fictional formation that all this infrastructure was designed to represent became FUSAG, the first United States Army group. On paper, FUSAG was a genuine military formation with authentic organizational structure, legitimate officers, and recognized command authority. In reality, FUSAG existed nowhere except in German intelligence files, classified planning documents, and the paperwork generated by a small staff of planners working in sealed facilities. General George S. Patton, Jr., the most senior American combat commander in the European theater, was assigned to command this phantom force. The selection was brilliant psychological warfare. Patton's reputation for aggressive tactics and tactical innovation was known even to German military planners. But more importantly, the Germans feared Patton more than they feared any other Allied general. They believed him to be reckless, capable of commanding an invasion force that would strike without warning. His assignment to command an invasion force would appear to confirm German expectations about where the primary invasion would occur. Patton, despite commanding no actual troops committed to this operation, began conducting activities designed to ensure his presence would be reported by German intelligence networks. He visited encampments where dummy vehicles were positioned. He appeared at ports where fake landing craft were being assembled. His movements were carefully orchestrated to be observed, or at least reported, by the network of German agents that British counterintelligence had penetrated and turned into unwitting participants in the deception. But here's where the deception became truly sophisticated. Patton wasn't simply appearing in public. He was appearing in locations that the Allies knew German spies were watching. He was meeting with officers who the Allies knew were reporting to Berlin. Every gesture, every inspection tour, every moment was designed to generate intelligence reports that German commanders would interpret as evidence of genuine invasion preparation. Photographers accompanying Patton's inspection tours ensured that visual evidence existed of the famous general supervising what German informants would interpret as genuine invasion preparations. Every detail was calculated to reinforce the broader deception architecture. Patton's public presence commanded respect among German military planners. His involvement with FUSAG transformed what might otherwise have been dismissed as suspicious activity into apparent confirmation of German assumptions about Allied invasion planning. The radio war, but visual deception could only accomplish so much. The Germans possessed intelligence sources beyond reconnaissance photographs. Radio intelligence, what the Allies called SIGINT, offered German analysts the opportunity to intercept and decode Allied communications. This represented both a vulnerability and an opportunity for the deception planners. The Allies had broken German radio codes. They knew precisely what German intelligence believed and what information would be most convincing to Nazi decision-makers. British radio operators, working from specially constructed facilities hidden in sealed rooms, began transmitting radio traffic that mimicked what a genuine military formation would generate. These were not simple broadcasts. They were sophisticated radio conversations that reflected actual military procedure and authentic tactical planning. Communications discussing unit movements, supply requests for made-up divisions, training schedules for phantom regiments, and operational planning for invasions that existed only in imagination. The content was carefully scripted, but sounded completely authentic to German analysts monitoring the transmissions. Radio operators transmitted messages in known Allied communication protocols. They used authentic radio call signs and frequency assignments. They created patterns of communication that matched what German intelligence analysts had learned to recognize as signatures of genuine military activity. Most importantly, they transmitted material that German intelligence could intercept and decode, allowing Nazi planners to discover evidence that they were receiving through their own intelligence capabilities. The psychological effect was precisely calculated. German military planners did not need allies to tell them that FUSAG existed. They needed only to discover its existence through their own intelligence networks. When German radio operators intercepted Allied communications discussing FUSAG operations, when German reconnaissance pilots photographed fake tank formations, when German intelligence agents reported observations of Patton touring inspection facilities, all these pieces of evidence convinced German decision-makers that the information had been independently verified through multiple intelligence sources. The compromised networks. What the German intelligence apparatus did not comprehend was that every independent source of information had been compromised. The German spy networks operating inside England and Scotland had been systematically penetrated by British counterintelligence. Dozens of German agents had been captured and turned into double agents working against their former masters. The most famous was Juan Pujol Garcia, a Spanish double agent working under the codename Garbo. Pujol had invented an entire network of 27 fictional informants scattered across Britain. He created detailed biographical backgrounds for each fake spy, right down to their jobs, families, and where they supposedly lived. German intelligence believed they were receiving reports from real agents embedded across the British Isles. In reality, they were receiving reports written by British counterintelligence officers who understood precisely what information would be most convincing to German decision-makers. Pujol's transmissions described Fusag's assembly. His fictional agents reported sightings of American divisions. His made-up sources provided details about invasion preparations scheduled for mid-July against the Pas-de-Calais sector. The comprehensiveness of the deception was absolute. Every possible source of verification had been infiltrated and turned. German spies reported Fusag's existence. German reconnaissance photographs showed Fusag's equipment. German radio intelligence intercepted Fusag's communications. German military attachés heard rumors about Fusag in social settings carefully orchestrated by counterintelligence. From every angle, from every intelligence source, the evidence accumulated and reinforced itself into an overwhelming narrative. Hitler's conviction. By late May, as the genuine invasion preparations reached their final stages, German military intelligence had developed absolute conviction that the Pas-de-Calais sector faced assault from forces that actually existed only in inflatable rubber and British military planning. The Oberkommando des Heeres, the German Army High Command, had become certain, absolutely, unquestionably certain, that a second invasion would occur north of Normandy within 2 weeks of the initial D-Day assault. This conviction was not based on a single piece of evidence. It was based on convergent verification from multiple sources that all pointed toward identical conclusions. The redundancy of deception is what made it impossible to dismiss. If a German intelligence officer doubted the reconnaissance photographs, the radio intercepts offered corroboration. If radio intelligence seemed questionable, reports from double agents confirmed the same information. If agent reports appeared potentially unreliable, additional reconnaissance missions photographed the same facilities. Hitler himself, briefed on the intelligence assessment by his military staff, became convinced that Fusag represented the real invasion threat. His decades of military study, his intuitive grasp of strategy, his personal knowledge of both geography and doctrine, all of it pointed toward Pas-de-Calais as the inevitable invasion objective. The narrowest crossing, the most direct route to German territory, the location where conventional military logic dictated the Allies would strike. The psychological warfare planners understood something fundamental about Hitler's decision-making process. They didn't need to create false evidence so much as they needed to reinforce existing beliefs. Hitler had already convinced himself that Pas-de-Calais was the target. The Allies were simply confirming what Hitler already wanted to believe. The moment of decision. This conviction proved absolutely decisive in the hours and days following the Normandy landings on June 6, 1944. Hitler, having been convinced by months of accumulated false evidence that Pas-de-Calais represented the true invasion objective, retained massive reserve forces in northern France specifically to counter an invasion that would never come. The 15th Army, consisting of approximately 15 divisions of combat troops, over 150,000 soldiers, remained positioned to defend against Fusag's fictitious assault. These formations, which could have been rapidly deployed to reinforce German positions in Normandy, instead remained frozen in place by Hitler's direct order. The order was unambiguous: maintain defensive posture against invasion threat at Pas-de-Calais. Do not commit reserves to Normandy until the primary invasion is clearly identified. Hitler had learned from historical military misfortunes caused by commanders dispersing force in response to diversionary threats. He would not repeat those mistakes. His reserves would remain concentrated, waiting for the genuine invasion at the location where German intelligence had clearly identified it would occur. Major Norman Cota, observing the inflatable tanks being deflated and stored away in the weeks following D-Day, understood what had just transpired. He had witnessed an army defeated not by weapons or violence, but by a lie so comprehensive that it had become indistinguishable from truth. A lie so carefully constructed, so methodically verified through multiple intelligence sources that German commanders had based military decisions of historical consequence on rubber and wood and the disciplined imagination of British deception planners. The rubber soldiers had successfully convinced Nazi Germany that a phantom army of 400,000 troops existed in southeast England. They had held Hitler's strategic reserves immobilized for weeks after the real invasion began. They had bought time, precious hours when the Normandy beachhead was most vulnerable, by making Hitler fear an invasion that never came. The final accounting. In the weeks following D-Day, German commanders would finally receive permission to reposition their reserves toward Normandy. But by then, the moment of vulnerability had passed. The invasion force had grown too large, established too strong positions, and brought too much reinforcement across the Channel to be dislodged by hastily redeployed defensive formations. The rubber tanks would eventually be deflated and stored away. The wooden landing craft would be broken down for scrap material. The fake radio traffic would cease. The whole elaborate infrastructure of deception would be dismantled once it had served its purpose. But the Ghost Army had left an indelible mark on military history. It demonstrated that psychological warfare, carefully planned and comprehensively executed, could achieve tactical effects equivalent to entire divisions of actual troops. The inflatable tanks, the fake headquarters, the radio deception, the double agents, every element worked together to create a unified picture that was impossible to contradict because it came from too many independent sources. Cota, examining those rubber tanks one final time before fusag's components were disassembled, understood that he had witnessed something historically unprecedented. He had seen an entire strategic calculation defeated not by conventional military force, but by a lie so sophisticated that it had altered the course of an invasion. The question that historians would debate for decades was simple. How many German soldiers lost their lives because 15 divisions remained positioned at Pas-de-Calais instead of defending Normandy? How many American lives were saved because Hitler continued believing in an army made of rubber long after the real invasion had begun? The answer existed in the casualty statistics of the Normandy campaign. It existed in the soldiers who returned home instead of being buried in European soil. It existed in the wives who didn't become widows, the children who grew up knowing their fathers, the families that were never shattered by the telegram that German defenses at Normandy should have forced the Allies to send. The inflatable tanks had saved more lives through deception than most conventional weapons could save through firepower. The Ghost Army had achieved strategic victory not through violence, but through the careful manipulation of fear, psychology, and the German military's own preconceptions about where the real threat would materialize. In the quiet aftermath of war, when the rubber tanks were finally deflated and stored away, Major Norman Cota understood a truth that modern militaries are still discovering. Sometimes the most devastating weapon isn't a tank or aircraft or ship. Sometimes it's simply a well-constructed lie, told with sufficient conviction and verified through enough independent sources to become indistinguishable from truth. The rubber soldiers had won a victory that bullets and bombs couldn't match. January 1944, Berlin. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. Oberführer Alexei Steiger sits in the Radio Intercept Division, headphones wrapped around his ears, listening to the crackling static that connects Nazi Germany to its far-flung intelligence networks. He has been monitoring Allied radio traffic for 3 years. He knows the patterns, the rhythms, the individual characteristics of each Allied operator's Morse code transmission. Every operator, Steiger understood, had a distinctive fist, a particular rhythm and pattern that made their transmissions as recognizable as a fingerprint. This particular evening in January, Steiger begins to notice something unusual. New radio operators appearing in frequencies he has monitored for months. But these operators didn't arrive with the normal intelligence briefings or personnel transfers. They simply existed suddenly in the radio spectrum, transmitting messages about American military movements in southern England. The senior intercept officer at the station notices Steiger's confusion. "New formations," the officer explains. "Army group level transmissions. The Americans are preparing something significant." Steiger couldn't know that he was listening to the most carefully constructed lie in radio history. The architecture of phantom signals. The radio deception campaign that would become the electronic foundation of Operation Fortitude had begun months earlier. Allied planners understood a critical vulnerability in German intelligence methodology. They relied heavily on radio intercepts to verify the existence of Allied military formations. Visual reconnaissance could be deceived by inflatable tanks and dummy infrastructure. But radio communications provided something that photographs couldn't. They provided confirmation of operational reality. A dummy tank might be questioned, but a radio operator transmitting authentic military traffic using correct communication protocols, following proper military procedure, that was far more difficult to dismiss as fabricated. If German intelligence could intercept actual radio messages from American military units, those messages would validate everything else the Allies were trying to convince them of. The Signal Company Special, a unit of 296 hand-picked soldiers, became the architects of this electronic masquerade. These weren't ordinary radio operators. They were specialists in what military communications called spoof radio, the creation of entirely phantom radio networks that mimicked the characteristics of genuine military formations. Buried beneath the white cliffs of Dover in tunnels carved into chalk during medieval times and later refurbished as military installations, the operators worked in 8-hour rotating shifts. The repetitive, methodical nature of the work, sending encoded messages that the operators themselves didn't understand, created a strange psychological disconnection from the war. They weren't firing weapons, they weren't commanding troops. They were simply transmitting strings of dots and dashes into the electromagnetic spectrum, knowing only that their work was classified and important. Each operator in the Signal Company had been selected for a very specific reason: their ability to reproduce with absolute precision the individual characteristics of other radio operators' transmissions. Morse code transmission wasn't just about dots and dashes. Each operator had developed a unique sending style: the speed, the rhythm, the slight hesitations between letters. Professional signals intelligence officers could recognize an individual operator the way a musician recognizes a distinctive voice. The Allies used this against the Germans. They studied authentic American radio operators' transmissions. They analyzed the precise rhythm and pattern that identified each operator. Then they trained new operators to replicate those patterns with such accuracy that German intelligence monitors would never question whether the transmissions were authentic. The training program was rigorous and psychologically demanding. Allied signals specialists would play recordings of authentic American military radio traffic. The newly trained operators would listen and practice over and over until their transmission style matched the original operator's fist perfectly. Not approximately perfectly, exactly perfectly. The goal was absolute replication. The German intercept stations would hear what they expected to hear: known American military units transmitting about their movements and operational status. One operator, Sergeant James Mitchell, remembered his training with particular clarity. A 24-year-old from Ohio, Mitchell had been sent to Dover Castle for specialized instruction. "They played me a recording," Mitchell later recalled, "an American operator from a real division, and I had to copy him. Not just the speed, not just the rhythm, every hesitation, every tiny pause. It took weeks. They'd make me listen to the same 30-second sequence 100 times. But the deception went deeper than simple transmission mimicry. The operators created entirely phantom radio networks that corresponded to FUSAG's fictional command structure. Radio nets for FUSAG's non-existent corps headquarters. Communication networks for divisional units that existed only on organizational charts. Supply and logistics nets coordinating movements of phantom regiments. Each phantom unit's radio traffic followed the exact protocols that German intelligence analysts had learned to recognize as signatures of genuine American military activity. The radio operators didn't transmit random messages. They transmitted traffic that reflected what a real military formation would communicate. Tactical planning, supply requests, unit movements, training schedules, personnel rotations, medical evacuation procedures, maintenance reports. The first transmission. The first radio transmission from FUSAG's fictional 1st Army Group began in January 1944. British counterintelligence had calculated that German intelligence needed enough lead time to become convinced of FUSAG's existence before the actual D-Day invasion commenced. 5 months of radio traffic would provide sufficient verification. The messages transmitted by the signal company's special operators were carefully scripted to reflect authentic military operations planning. They included technical details that only military personnel would know. They referenced actual supply procedures and communication protocols. They mentioned real American military installations and genuine logistics procedures. But more importantly, they contained the small, mundane details that made deception credible. Request authorization for 47 personnel transfer to support invasion planning. Division supply requesting tank ammunition shipments for training exercises. Corps signal reporting completion of communications net testing. Personnel department submitting casualty projections for coastal assault operations. To an untrained ear, the messages were tedious administrative traffic, exactly what any military formation would generate. To a professional signals intelligence officer analyzing them as evidence of military activity, they were indistinguishable from genuine American military communications. German radio operators monitoring these transmissions would hear messages that appeared completely authentic. The intercept stations captured tens of thousands of these messages. Radio operators recorded the transmissions on magnetic tape, a relatively new technology in 1944. Signals intelligence officers analyzed them. Message traffic was logged, cataloged, and incorporated into the growing intelligence assessments about FUSAG's composition and readiness. Mitchell, transmitting FUSAG traffic from Dover Castle, had no idea that his precise replication of a genuine American operator's Morse code fist was contributing to one of the most significant military deceptions in history. He knew only that his work was classified, that the messages were encoded before transmission, and that his accuracy was constantly monitored and evaluated. Any deviation from the assigned operator's transmission style would result in retraining. Any inconsistency would compromise the deception. By February, German intelligence had detected at least 27 different radio operators transmitting from FUSAG's various command nets. By March, they had cataloged over 50 distinct operators. Each one had a distinctive transmission style. Each one appeared to belong to different American military units. Each one seemed to confirm the existence of separate American formations being assembled in southern England. Steiger, reviewing the intercept reports, began constructing a map of FUSAG's organizational structure based purely on radio traffic patterns. 1st Army Group Headquarters, 4 Corps, 11 divisions, support elements for air, naval, and logistics operations. The organizational structure on his map grew more detailed with each month that passed. The evidence accumulated. The message that changed everything. But the supreme test of the radio deception came not in January or February, but on June 9, 1944, 3 days after the Normandy landings had begun. On that date, Juan Pujol Garcia, the Spanish double agent working under the code name Garbo, transmitted what would become the most historically significant radio message of the entire operation. Garbo had been transmitting hundreds of messages to German intelligence for months, messages about Fusag's assembly, reports about Patton's activities, observations about the massive concentration of American forces in southeast England. But on June 9th, Garbo transmitted a message that would crystallize everything. A comprehensive analysis claiming that the Normandy landings were a diversionary operation and that the real invasion would occur at Pas-de-Calais, commanded by General Patton's Fusag, within 2 weeks. The message was structured with absolute brilliance. Garbo reported that he had met with his network of 27 fictional agents, all of whom had independently verified the existence of Fusag. He provided specific details about division positions, equipment concentrations, and invasion timeline. He emphasized that the Normandy operation, while significant, represented only a secondary thrust designed to distract German defenses away from the real invasion. Most importantly, Garbo requested that his message be transmitted urgently to the German High Command, to Hitler himself if necessary. Meanwhile, beneath Dover Castle, Sergeant Mitchell and his fellow operators were continuing to transmit radio traffic from Fusag command nets. The timing was coordinated with precision that the operators themselves didn't fully understand. Garbo's message about Fusag reached German High Command. Simultaneously, the radio intercept stations monitoring Fusag's communications were receiving messages that corroborated Garbo's claims. Supply requests increased. Personnel movement traffic intensified. Unit commanders transmitted messages discussing invasion preparations. The brilliance of this synchronized deception lay in its timing. The Normandy landings had already commenced. German commanders were already scrambling to understand what was happening. In the chaos of conflicting reports and military confusion, Garbo's message provided an answer that made intuitive sense. The Normandy landings are real, but they're not the main invasion. The real threat lies at Pas-de-Calais. The real invasion force is still assembling under Patton. The radio traffic proves it. German High Command received Garbo's message. They analyzed it. They cross-referenced it with radio intercepts from Fusag's communication nets. They reviewed photographic reconnaissance of the fake tank formations. They consulted reports from their other intelligence agents. Every piece of evidence pointed in the same direction. The Normandy landings are the secondary operation. Pas-de-Calais is the real target. The moral calculus of electronic warfare. The question that modern historians have struggled with is profound. How much of Garbo's message was fabrication, and how much was psychological manipulation of extraordinary sophistication? In reality, Garbo was completely aware that the Normandy landings represented the main invasion. He knew there was no Fusag force preparing to assault Pas-de-Calais. The message was pure misdirection designed to manipulate German military decision-making. Yet Garbo wrote the message as if he himself doubted the Normandy landings' significance. He transmitted it with genuine urgency. He requested it be conveyed to the highest levels of German command. He created an emotional subtext suggesting that he, a valuable German intelligence agent embedded in enemy territory, was providing vital information that could save the German cause. The effect was masterful. German commanders reading Garbo's message believed they were receiving intelligence from an agent on the ground in England who was delivering information that contradicted the apparent obvious, that the Normandy landings represented the main invasion. Garbo appeared to be saying, "I know you think this Normandy operation is the real invasion, but my sources tell me something different. My agents, all 27 of them, agree. The real invasion is coming at Pas-de-Calais." The psychological manipulation was the key. Garbo made it psychologically easier for Hitler and German High Command to believe what they already wanted to believe. He provided them with an explanation for why the Normandy landings, if they were real, still didn't represent the true invasion. He gave them an intellectually coherent framework for dismissing what their commanders on the ground were telling them. radio silence, and strategic paralysis. But Garbo's message alone wouldn't have been sufficient. The power of the deception came from its validation through multiple independent intelligence sources operating across completely separate channels. The radio operators of the Signal Company Special were transmitting messages from FUSAG command nets around the same time that Garbo was reporting on FUSAG's status. German intercept operators were monitoring this radio traffic, logging it, analyzing it as evidence of American military activity. The synchronization was calculated with precision. Garbo reports FUSAG exists. Radio intercepts confirm FUSAG's radio transmissions. Reconnaissance photographs show FUSAG's equipment and facilities. German double agents report observations of Patton's movements. German military attachés receive rumors about FUSAG in social settings. From every intelligence source, human intelligence, signals intelligence, photographic reconnaissance, prisoner interrogations, the evidence accumulated into a unified picture. FUSAG existed. FUSAG commanded 11 divisions of American troops. FUSAG would assault Pas-de-Calais 2 weeks after the Normandy landings commenced. One of the most sophisticated elements of the radio deception came in the weeks after the Normandy landings began. The operators of the Signal Company Special gradually decreased the volume of FUSAG radio traffic. The transmissions became less frequent. The message content shifted slightly, suggesting operational constraints and movement restrictions. German intelligence analysts, monitoring this decreased radio activity, interpreted it as evidence that FUSAG was preparing for imminent deployment. Radio silence before a major military operation was standard procedure. The reduction in traffic wasn't a sign that the deception was failing. It was a sign that the invasion force was achieving operational readiness. Weeks passed. The Normandy beachhead expanded. American and British forces broke out of the initial lodgment. German commanders continued to expect the Pas-de-Calais assault. Weeks became a month. A month became 6 weeks. The entire strategic situation evolved, yet German high command still maintained reserves at Pas-de-Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. The final message and final understanding. It wasn't until mid-July 1944, 6 weeks after the Normandy landings, that German high command finally accepted that FUSAG probably didn't exist as a genuine military formation. Even then, they maintained significant forces at Pas-de-Calais, uncertain whether the Allies might still attempt another invasion at that location. But by then, the strategic moment had passed. The 15 divisions that had been frozen in place waiting for Patton's Phantom Army could have been deployed to Normandy 6 weeks earlier. The vulnerability of the initial beachhead could have been exploited. The course of the invasion might have been entirely different. Back in Berlin, Oberfuhrer Steiger never fully understood what had happened. He would spend weeks after the war analyzing German intercept reports, trying to understand how the intelligence service could have been so thoroughly deceived. He would review the radio traffic logs, the operator reports, the intercept officers' assessments. All of it pointed to the same conclusion. FUSAG had existed. The radio traffic proved it. The operators' fists proved it. The signals patterns proved it. It wasn't until years later, when Allied deception operations were partially declassified, that Steiger finally understood the truth. The radio operators he had been monitoring weren't American soldiers. They were British intelligence specialists transmitting phantom military communications. The operators whose fists he had studied so carefully were replicas of real American operators. The messages he had analyzed so carefully were crafted lies. The German officer felt a peculiar mixture of emotions: professional admiration for the sophistication of the deception, frustration at having been so thoroughly misled, and a dawning recognition that his career as an intelligence officer had been fundamentally undermined by an opponent who understood the psychology of signals intelligence better than he did. The operator's final transmission, the last FUSAG radio transmission from the Signal Company Special Operators, came in August 1944. By then, the deception's strategic purpose had been accomplished. The 15th Army, which should have been defending Normandy during the critical period when the beachhead was vulnerable, had been immobilized at Pas-de-Calais by fear of an invasion that existed only in German intelligence files and the radio transmissions of British operators. Sergeant Mitchell, sitting at his radio set beneath Dover Castle for what would be one of the final times, transmitted a message about routine supply matters, supply shipments, personnel rotations, maintenance schedules. Nothing dramatic, nothing that distinguished it from the hundreds of other messages that had been transmitted over the previous months. But Mitchell knew it was the last message. He had been told by his commanding officer that Fusag's role in the deception was ending. The transmissions would cease. The Phantom Army would simply fade away from the radio spectrum. When the message was complete, Mitchell removed his headphones and sat in the silence of the underground facility. Around him, other operators were also completing their final transmissions. The room felt strangely empty, despite being filled with military personnel. They had spent months transmitting messages that no one was supposed to actually receive. They had spoken to an enemy through radio waves, and the enemy had listened. The enemy had believed. Mitchell never knew how many German soldiers' lives might have been saved or lost because of the radio deceptions he had transmitted. He never learned that the messages he had so carefully replicated, matching the fist of an operator he had never met, had contributed to keeping 150,000 German soldiers immobilized at Pas-de-Calais while the Normandy invasion proceeded with reduced opposition. When he left the service after the war, Mitchell returned to Ohio and worked as a civilian communications technician. He rarely discussed his wartime service. When he did, he explained that he had been a radio operator who transmitted some messages. Very few people understood that those messages had been among the most significant communications of World War II. The Ghost Army's final echo. The radio operators of the Signal Company Special had spent months transmitting phantom communications from military units that existed only on organizational charts and in German intelligence files. They had replicated the transmission styles of operators they had never met. They had communicated on behalf of divisions that had no soldiers, from corps headquarters that had no headquarters, following command structures that existed only in the imaginations of Allied deception planners. When the war ended, the operators returned to civilian life. Few people would ever know what they had done. Few would understand that their careful transmissions of fabricated communications, the invented operator identities, the phantom military formations, the meticulously crafted message traffic, had shaped the outcome of an invasion that changed the course of history. But the radio messages they transmitted, the phantom traffic nets, the invented operator personalities, the carefully orchestrated military formations, had spoken to the enemy through the electromagnetic spectrum. And the enemy had believed so completely that they positioned their strategic reserves in exactly the location where they could never be used. The Ghost Army had spoken, and the enemy had listened. Years later, when Steiger finally understood the truth about Fusag's deception, he would reportedly comment to colleagues, "They defeated us not with weapons or soldiers, but with the precision of their lies. And we were so eager to believe those lies that we made their deception work for them." The radio signals that Sergeant Mitchell and his fellow operators had transmitted beneath Dover Castle had been erased from existence as soon as they were broadcast. They existed for only a fraction of a second, long enough to be intercepted and recorded, long enough to be analyzed and interpreted, long enough to convince an enemy to make strategic decisions that would shape the war's outcome. But those signals, invisible, electromagnetic, composed of nothing but dots and dashes, had moved the pieces of a military chessboard across a continent, immobilized armies, and altered the course of history. The most devastating weapon of Operation Fortitude wasn't made of rubber or wood or steel. It was made of precisely timed Morse code, transmitted from underground bunkers by soldiers whose names would never be recorded in official histories, speaking to enemies who would never understand the truth until the war was long over. June 7, 1944. The Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat in Bavaria. The morning sun filters through the windows of the conference room, but Adolf Hitler isn't looking at the light. He's staring at intelligence reports spread across the mahogany table, his hands trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from the pharmaceutical cocktail his personal physician had administered 3 hours earlier. Dr. Theodor Morell, Hitler's personal medical advisor, had injected him with a mixture containing amphetamines, steroids, and various stimulants designed to sustain the Führer through crisis situations. The resulting state was one of heightened alertness mixed with profound distrust. The reports describe American forces landing on beaches in Normandy. 5 separate landing zones, massive naval support, airborne divisions dropped behind German lines, British and American paratroopers establishing strongholds inland. The tactical picture is unambiguous. The invasion has commenced. But Hitler doesn't believe it. "This is a diversion," he says, his voice carrying the absolute certainty that has defined his military decision-making since 1940. The real invasion will come at Pas-de-Calais. Patton is still waiting. The Americans would never commit their best general to a secondary operation. This is a trap designed to pull our reserves away from the real objective. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, standing at attention beside the table, hesitates before responding. The Normandy landings are clearly massive in scale. Intelligence reports from the front describe overwhelming Allied firepower. German military observers are reporting that the beach operations involve hundreds of ships, thousands of troops, coordinated air and naval support. But Hitler's conviction is absolute. More troublingly, the Führer's conviction is supported by intelligence from multiple sources: radio intercepts, reconnaissance photographs, agent reports, all pointing toward a second, larger invasion force assembling in southeast England. What Hitler doesn't understand, what his own psychological profile prevents him from understanding, is that the Allies have been studying him for years. They understand his paranoia, his obsessive need for control, his conviction that enemies are always plotting more elaborate schemes than they actually are. And they have turned that paranoia into a weapon more devastating than any conventional military force: the psychological weaponization. The operation to deceive Hitler didn't begin with inflatable tanks or radio transmissions. It began in 1942, when British intelligence commissioned a classified psychological assessment of Adolf Hitler's mental state. The report, written by Canadian psychiatrist Dr. Henry Murray, working with British intelligence analysts, identified 3 dominant psychological tendencies in the Nazi leader's decision-making process. The first was what the analysts called shamanism, Hitler's belief that he possessed intuitive insight superior to conventional military analysis. He frequently overruled his generals based on instinct rather than tactical assessment. He believed his political intuition gave him strategic understanding that professional soldiers lacked. The second tendency was described as oscillation, sudden shifts between grandiose confidence and apocalyptic despair. Hitler's mood swings had become legendary among his staff. Victory reports would trigger euphoria and immediate planning for even more ambitious operations. Setbacks would produce rage, accusations of betrayal, and demands for impossible counterattacks. But the third tendency was the most exploitable: pathological distrust. Hitler had developed what the psychiatrists termed a messiah complex, a conviction that he was leading a chosen people in a cosmic struggle against diabolical enemies who were constantly plotting elaborate conspiracies. He saw threats everywhere. He suspected betrayal in every unexpected development. He believed his enemies were always more organized, more sophisticated, more dangerous than they actually were. The Allied deception planners understood something profound. Hitler's paranoid psychology meant he would always believe the more complex explanation over the simpler one. If presented with 2 possibilities, that Normandy was the invasion or that Normandy was a diversion for a larger invasion at Pas-de-Calais, Hitler's distrust would compel him to believe the latter. The more elaborate conspiracy would always seem more credible to a mind convinced that enemies were plotting on multiple levels. Lieutenant Colonel David Strangeways, one of the key architects of the deception campaign, reportedly told colleagues, "We're not deceiving Hitler with our lies. We're allowing him to deceive himself with his own psychology. We're simply providing him with evidence that confirms what he already wants to believe. His mind will do the rest of the work for us." The perfect target for psychological manipulation. Hitler's suspicion wasn't random or superficial. It had been shaped by decades of political struggle, multiple assassination attempts, and a worldview that interpreted all events through the lens of conspiracy. He believed enemies were constantly plotting his destruction through elaborate, multi-layered schemes. Simple, straightforward military operations seemed implausible to him. His mind naturally gravitated toward complex explanations that suggested deeper threats lurking beneath apparent reality. This made him the perfect target for Operation Fortitude's multi-source deception architecture. The inflatable tanks, the fabricated radio transmissions, the turned agent reports, none of these would have convinced a rational military strategist capable of critical analysis. Any single element, examined skeptically by a professional intelligence officer, would reveal inconsistencies and technical impossibilities. But Hitler's paranoid psychology didn't examine evidence with skepticism. Instead, it looked for patterns that confirmed his pre-existing beliefs about enemy conspiracy. When reconnaissance photographs showed tank formations in southeast England, Hitler didn't question whether those tanks were genuine. He questioned what the Allies were trying to hide by positioning them so obviously. When radio intercepts suggested FUSAG's existence and operational planning, Hitler didn't doubt the intelligence sources. He assumed the Americans were foolish enough to allow their communications to be intercepted, revealing the real invasion plan, the diversionary Normandy operation, and the actual main invasion coming later. Most critically, when agent reports from Juan Pujol Garcia, Garbo, and other turned double agents described FUSAG's preparations and strategic threat, Hitler didn't suspect the agents had been compromised by British counterintelligence. He believed he was receiving intelligence from deep cover operatives embedded in enemy territory, precisely the kind of sophisticated intelligence network that his conspiratorial worldview assumed would naturally exist. The psychological warfare experts had calculated this perfectly. Hitler would always prefer the explanation that suggested his enemies were more competent, more organized, and more dangerous than they appeared. A straightforward invasion at Normandy seemed too simple, too direct, too ordinary. But a two-stage invasion with a diversionary assault at Normandy, followed by the real main invasion at Pas-de-Calais, commanded by Patton, that fit Hitler's psychological model of how sophisticated enemies would operate. The moment of maximum psychological vulnerability. But understanding Hitler's psychology was only half the challenge. The Allies also had to time their deception perfectly to exploit a specific moment of psychological vulnerability: the hours and days immediately following the Normandy landings. June 6, 1944, created a crisis of interpretation for German High Command. American and British forces were landing on Normandy beaches in obvious strength. The naval forces supporting the operation were massive. Airborne divisions had been dropped behind German lines. Every tactical indicator suggested this was a major operation, not a secondary diversion. Yet Hitler's paranoid psychology resisted this obvious interpretation. At 1:30 a.m. on June 6, hours before the major landings began, Hitler had retired to bed after receiving preliminary reports of airborne operations. His staff chose not to wake him, a decision that would become historically significant. When Hitler finally received comprehensive briefings about the Normandy landings later that morning, his immediate reaction was suspicion rather than alarm. "Where is Patton?" Hitler reportedly asked his staff, referring to General George S. Patton, Jr., whom German military intelligence considered the most capable American general. The Americans wouldn't execute a major invasion without Patton commanding. This must be preliminary to the main operation. The real invasion is still coming at Pas-de-Calais. German intelligence officers pulled files on FUSAG. Radio intercepts showed continued activity from Patton's Phantom Army Group headquarters. Agent reports from Garbo and his fictional network confirmed FUSAG remained assembled in southeast England, preparing for deployment. Reconnaissance photographs showed the tank formations and landing craft that suggested invasion preparations at maximum alert. From every intelligence source, radio reconnaissance, photographic evidence, human intelligence, the convergent verification pointed in the same direction. FUSAG still existed, still threatened Pas-de-Calais, still represented the primary invasion force. Hitler's suspicion transformed this accumulated evidence into absolute certainty. The Normandy operation, while significant, was clearly designed to draw German reserves away from the real invasion target. Patton was waiting. The Allies would sacrifice thousands of soldiers in a diversionary operation to achieve strategic surprise at the real invasion location. This was exactly the kind of complex, multi-layered conspiracy that Hitler's suspicious psychology expected enemies to execute. The order that determined the campaign's outcome. On June 7th, one day after the Normandy landings commenced, Hitler issued the directive that would define the entire campaign. The 15th Army, consisting of 15 divisions and approximately 150,000 soldiers positioned at Pas-de-Calais, would remain in defensive positions. They would not be committed to counterattack operations in Normandy. They would maintain their current deployment, waiting for the real invasion that Hitler was absolutely certain would materialize within 2 weeks. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, attempted to argue against this decision. His commanders on the ground in Normandy were requesting immediate reinforcement. The beachhead was vulnerable. Every hour of delay allowed the Allies to strengthen their positions exponentially. But Hitler's conviction was unshakable. Moving forces from Pas-de-Calais would leave that sector vulnerable to Patton's assault, an assault that German intelligence continued to confirm was imminent. General Günther Blumentritt, von Rundstedt's chief of staff, would later recall in post-war interviews, "The Führer was convinced, absolutely, irrevocably convinced, that Normandy was a feint. No amount of tactical reporting from our commanders on the ground could persuade him otherwise. He believed he understood the strategic picture better than the officers actually observing the battle. His conviction was based on what he called intuitive understanding of enemy strategy. We were not fighting a rational military opponent. We were fighting psychological certainty rooted in paranoia." This wasn't irrational stubbornness motivated by pride or ego. It was paranoid psychology reinforced by carefully constructed evidence that appeared to come from multiple independent sources. Hitler had been presented with intelligence from radio intercepts, photographic reconnaissance, and human agents, all confirming that FUSAG existed and threatened Pas-de-Calais. His suspicious worldview interpreted this convergence of evidence as absolute proof of Allied intentions. What Hitler didn't understand, what his psychological profile prevented him from understanding, was that every independent intelligence source had been systematically compromised. The radio intercepts were transmitted by British operators mimicking American military communication procedures. The reconnaissance photographs showed inflatable rubber equipment and wooden mock-ups. The human intelligence came from double agents working for British counterintelligence. The entire intelligence apparatus that he relied on to confirm his paranoid suspicions had been turned into an instrument designed specifically to manipulate his decision-making. The self-reinforcing cycle of suspicion, but the most psychologically sophisticated element of the deception was how it created a self-reinforcing feedback loop with Hitler's paranoia. Every day that passed without the expected Pas-de-Calais invasion didn't decrease Hitler's certainty. It increased it exponentially. When June 10th arrived without the expected invasion, Hitler interpreted this not as disconfirmation of his theory, but as evidence of Allied caution and discipline. They were waiting for German reserves to commit to Normandy. The moment of invasion was being deliberately delayed for maximum effect. When June 15th passed, Hitler saw this as proof of Allied sophistication and strategic patience. They understood the value of psychological pressure. They were deliberately prolonging German uncertainty. When June 20th approached with no Pas-de-Calais assault, Hitler's staff suggested that perhaps the intelligence about Fusaggi's existence had been incorrect. Hitler's response was telling and revealing of his paranoid psychology. The delay proves they're more dangerous than we thought. They possess the discipline to wait for perfect conditions. They're not acting out of desperation. They're executing a carefully calculated plan. We must maintain our vigilance. The invasion at Pas-de-Calais is coming. The delay only proves how seriously the Americans are taking this operation. The paranoid mind doesn't accept contradictory evidence as refutation. Instead, it reinterprets contradictory evidence as further proof of the conspiracy's sophistication and complexity. The absence of the expected invasion became, in Hitler's psychology, evidence of how carefully and patiently the Allies were planning it. Lieutenant General Hans Speidel, General Erwin Rommel's chief of staff in Normandy, would later write in his memoirs, "We were not fighting Allied deception. We were fighting the Führer's own mind. His conviction that the Allies were executing a complex conspiracy was so absolute that no tactical reality could penetrate it." The psychological deception had become self-sustaining. The more obvious the reality of the Normandy situation became, the more Hitler interpreted it as confirmation of the deception plan. We were trapped inside the Führer's paranoia. The catastrophic strategic consequences. By late June, the strategic situation in Normandy had fundamentally transformed. The Allied beachhead had expanded dramatically. American forces had cut across the Cotentin Peninsula, isolating Cherbourg and establishing secure positions. British and Canadian forces were gradually pushing toward Caen, despite fierce resistance. The invasion that Hitler had dismissed as a diversionary operation 3 weeks earlier had become the dominant military reality in Western Europe. Yet even as late as July 4th, nearly a month after D-Day, Hitler continued to insist with absolute certainty that the 15th Army maintained defensive positions at Pas-de-Calais. Intelligence reports continued to describe Fusaggi's presence in southeast England. Radio intercepts continued to indicate invasion preparation. Agent reports continued to describe imminent assault operations. The Phantom Army's psychological hold over Hitler's paranoid mind proved more powerful than the actual military catastrophe developing in Normandy. His generals, witnessing the Normandy forces being gradually overwhelmed by superior Allied forces that should have been contained by the 15th Army, began to understand that they were fighting not just Allied military power, but the psychological consequences of their own leaders' distrust. General Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff, reportedly told colleagues in despair, "We cannot defeat the enemy in Normandy because we're fighting with one hand tied behind our back. The other hand remains at Pas-de-Calais, frozen in place by the Führer's conviction that an invasion will occur there. We are not being defeated by American military superiority. We are being defeated by German psychology, specifically the Führer's paranoia about phantom threats." It wasn't until mid-July, 6 weeks after D-Day, that Hitler finally, reluctantly, with extreme reluctance, authorized the redeployment of significant forces from Pas-de-Calais to Normandy. By then, the moment of Allied vulnerability had passed irrevocably. The beachhead was too strong, the reinforcements too substantial, the breakout preparation too advanced. The 15 divisions that should have counterattacked the vulnerable invasion force on June 7th arrived in Normandy in late July, facing an Allied army that had grown exponentially stronger with each passing week. Paranoia weaponized. What the Allies had accomplished was unprecedented in military psychology and operational art. They hadn't simply deceived Hitler about Allied intentions. They had weaponized his own paranoia against him. Every psychological tendency that had defined Hitler's rise to power, his conviction that he possessed superior intuition, his belief in elaborate conspiracies, his assumption that enemies were always more sophisticated than they appeared, had been transformed into instruments of his own strategic defeat. The inflatable tanks and radio transmissions weren't the real weapons. The real weapon was Hitler's mind itself, specifically his pathological inability to accept that the invasion could be as straightforward as it appeared. His paranoid psychology demanded complex explanations for everything. The Allies simply provided evidence that allowed him to construct the complex explanation he was psychologically compelled to believe. Colonel Roger Hesketh, who later wrote the classified history of Operation Fortitude, observed, "We succeeded not because our deception was technically perfect. It wasn't. Several aspects of FUSAG would have been penetrated by skeptical analysis. We succeeded because we understood Hitler's psychology better than he understood himself. We knew he would interpret evidence through the lens of suspicion. We knew he would prefer the complex conspiracy to the simple truth. We gave him exactly what his psychology required to deceive himself. We made the lie align perfectly with his pre-existing beliefs." The historical reckoning. In the years after the war, when the full scope of Operation Fortitude became known to military strategists and historians, the operation was studied not as an example of technical deception, though it was technically sophisticated, but as a case study in psychological manipulation and how to weaponize an adversary's own psychology against them. The lesson was historically profound. Sometimes the most effective weapon against an enemy isn't military force, but an understanding of how that enemy's mind works, and how their own paranoid thinking can be systematized and turned against them. Hitler's pathological distrust, which he had believed was a tool for detecting enemy conspiracies, had become the instrument of his greatest strategic failure. The Phantom Army existed nowhere except in the mind of the man whose paranoid psychology made him unable to distinguish between real threats and phantom conspiracies constructed by enemies who understood how his mind worked better than he did himself. The most devastating weapon deployed at D-Day wasn't manufactured in American factories or assembled in training camps. It was manufactured in Hitler's own psychological profile, assembled over decades of paranoid thinking and conspiratorial worldview, and deployed against him by opponents who understood that sometimes the best way to defeat a paranoid adversary is simply to provide them with exactly what their paranoia expects to see. July 1944. The beaches of Normandy. Sergeant Robert Collins, a 22-year-old from Nebraska, sits in a shallow foxhole in the bocage, the dense hedgerow country of northern France. His uniform is soaked with blood that isn't all his own. Around him, bodies lay motionless in various states of decomposition. Some have been there since June 6th, nearly a month ago. The smell is something that no training could have prepared him for. It's not just the smell of death. It's the smell of summer heat accelerating decay, of insects that have discovered abundant food, of earth mixed with things that were once human. Collins watches as German shells arc across the sky and strike positions 50 meters away. The earth trembles. Dust and smoke rise. A soldier to his left suddenly goes silent, his screams replaced by a silence more unsettling than the noise. An officer, seeing Collins watching the impact zone, motions him to focus on his perimeter defense rather than the casualties. Detachment is a survival skill. "We're holding," the officer says, though his voice suggests he doesn't entirely believe his own words. Command says the 15th Army can't be redeployed from Pas-de-Calais. Intelligence says another invasion is coming there. We hold here long enough and we can break out. Just a few more weeks of this. Collins nods, but his mind is elsewhere. He's thinking about the casualty figures he's heard whispered in dark moments when officers thought enlisted men weren't listening. The medics mentioned that American divisions have suffered losses equivalent to half their original combat strength. Tank companies that started the war with 17 tanks now command 4. Officer casualty rates are approaching 50%. Entire platoons have been reduced to squads. The Normandy beachhead is holding, but barely at tremendous cost, with losses approaching catastrophic levels. An officer walks past carrying a field report. Collins catches fragments. First Army reports another 2,000 casualties today, 1,200 in the 1st Division sector alone. Breakout delayed another week minimum. German resistance intensifying. What Collins doesn't know, what no enlisted soldier in the European theater knows, is that his survival depends on a ghost army that doesn't exist. That the reason he's still alive, that the reason the German 15th Army hasn't committed 150,000 soldiers to counterattack his vulnerable position is because of inflatable rubber tanks and carefully forged radio messages transmitted by operators sitting in bunkers beneath the white cliffs of Dover. The calculus of death and survival, the ultimate measure of Operation Fortitude's success, lies not in how completely it fooled German intelligence. It lies in the men still alive who would have been dead if the deception had failed. It lies in Sergeant Collins, in his foxhole in the bocage, and in approximately 30,000 to 50,000 men like him. The pre-invasion casualty estimates had been apocalyptic. American military planners studying historical amphibious operations and analyzing German defensive capabilities had conducted rigorous analysis that produced unsettling conclusions. The Normandy landings would result in massive casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. Conservative estimates projected 100,000 Allied casualties. Some military planners, gaming out worst-case scenarios where German reserves committed immediately, projected casualties approaching 200,000 American soldiers alone. The calculations were brutal and specific. Amphibious assault against defended beaches is among the most lethal forms of warfare known. The defenders possess prepared positions, control of the terrain, established fields of fire, and time to prepare defensive systems. The attackers emerge from the sea, soaking wet, exhausted from the crossing, carrying heavy equipment through water and sand, facing concentrated firepower from positions they cannot effectively suppress. Historical precedent was instructive and frightening. The Gallipoli campaign in World War I had resulted in 250,000 casualties for limited territorial gain. The Dardanelles had been abandoned after appalling losses. Amphibious operations against prepared defenses had consistently produced casualty rates exceeding 30%. Allied commanders had prepared for catastrophe. Eisenhower had written and hidden a statement accepting full responsibility for the invasion's failure in case the operation ended in disaster. The statement read, "If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." Eisenhower understood that Normandy beachheads could be established, but if German reserves committed with full strength, the beachheads could also be eliminated. But the 15th Army never came. The actual D-Day casualties, approximately 10,500 Allied soldiers on the first day, with 4,414 confirmed dead, represented only about 10% of the conservative casualty projections. This disparity between projection and reality wasn't because the Germans were unprepared. The German defensive positions at Normandy were formidable. It was because the German 15th Army, consisting of 15 divisions with approximately 150,000 soldiers equipped with artillery, armor, and organic support units, remained in defensive positions at Pas-de-Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. The delay, 6 weeks from June 6th until mid-July, when the 15th Army finally began redeploying to Normandy, prevented a catastrophic number of additional Allied casualties. Military historians would later calculate that without Operation Fortitude, without the Phantom Army's psychological hold over Hitler's paranoid mind, the Normandy campaign would have resulted in approximately 30,000 to 50,000 additional Allied casualties. Some estimates suggested the number could be higher, potentially as high as 100,000 if the 15th Army had committed counterattacks in the first critical days after D-Day. The Ghost Army had saved more lives through psychological deception than conventional military forces could have saved through firepower. The faces of Fortitude's impact. But casualty statistics are abstractions, numbers on intelligence reports, figures in military histories, data points in strategic analyses. The true measure of Operation Fortitude's success lies in faces and families, in the individual human beings who survived because their enemy was deceived. Private First Class James Patterson, serving with the 1st Infantry Division, was seriously wounded on June 15th. A German 80 mm shell, the most feared weapon in the German arsenal, struck the stone farmhouse he was using for defensive positions. The explosion tore through the structure. Shrapnel and stone fragments became projectiles. Patterson took a fragment through his abdomen, puncturing his intestines and lacerating his liver. In normal circumstances where German reserves were committed to aggressive counterattack on D-Day, where the beachhead was under siege from multiple directions, where the evacuation chain was completely overwhelmed by an impossible casualty load, Patterson would never have received surgical attention. The field hospitals would have been buried under thousands of casualties. Triage would have been ruthless. Men with abdominal wounds were categorized as expectant, likely to die regardless of treatment. Resources were reserved for soldiers with survivable injuries. Patterson would have been placed in the expectant category. He would have been given morphine for pain management and left to die in as much comfort as could be provided under battlefield conditions. His family would have received a casualty notification. Another statistic in what military planners had calculated would be a bloodbath. But because the German 15th Army wasn't committing to Normandy, evacuation operations could proceed at a manageable pace. Field hospitals weren't completely overwhelmed. Surgical teams had capacity to treat wounded soldiers who would have been triaged as expectant under worse circumstances. Patterson was transported to a field hospital. A surgeon, not completely exhausted from 18-hour shifts, treating an endless stream of casualties, but operating with manageable surgical loads, examined Patterson's wounds. The damage was severe, but survivable with immediate surgical intervention. The surgeon opened Patterson's abdomen, found the perforations in his intestines, and performed repair surgery. Liver damage was controlled through careful suturing. Antibiotics, precious in 1944 but available, were administered. Patterson received blood transfusions. He was placed under observation. The wound became infected despite antibiotics. Peritonitis developed. Patterson ran a fever of 104 degrees for 3 days. Medical personnel prepared for his death. But antibiotics continued, and Patterson's constitution was strong. The infection gradually came under control. He survived. A nurse named Margaret O'Brien from County Cork, Ireland, spent nights monitoring his recovery. She would later become his wife. 73 years later, in 2017, Patterson died in his sleep at age 95. He had 3 children with Margaret, a teacher named Elizabeth, a physician named Michael, and an engineer named David. Together, his 3 children raised 9 grandchildren. Patterson's family, his wife, his children, his 9 grandchildren, all exist because a ghost army deceived Hitler into keeping reserves at Pas-de-Calais. Patterson's family represents just one of tens of thousands. Multiply his experience by 30,000 to 50,000 soldiers who survived serious wounds because field hospitals weren't overwhelmed. Soldiers who received surgery because medical personnel weren't completely exhausted. Soldiers who lived through infections because antibiotics and medical attention were available. Every one of those soldiers came home. Every one of them had families. Every one of them shaped the future through descendants who would never have been born if the 15th Army had committed to Normandy. The ripple effects of survival. The impact extends beyond the immediate calculation of surviving soldiers. Each man who survived because the 15th Army didn't counterattack influenced the post-war world through his choices, his family, his professional career, his community impact. Corporal Thomas Riley, 20 years old when he landed at Normandy, survived the entire campaign despite being wounded twice, once at Normandy and again during the breakout from the bocage. Riley returned to the United States and became a high school history teacher. He taught history at Westbrook High School in Portland, Maine for 38 years. During those decades, Riley influenced approximately 4,700 students. Several of his students entered military service because of his teaching about the war. Some became officers. Some became career non-commissioned officers. One of Riley's students, inspired by his classroom discussions of deception and intelligence warfare, became a historian and wrote 3 books on military strategy. The ripple effects of Riley's survival, his ability to teach, to shape young minds, to influence generations, traced directly to Operation Fortitude. Sergeant Harold Freeman, 24, survived the Normandy campaign but was captured during a German counterattack in July. Freeman spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner. He survived the camp, was liberated in May 1945, and returned home weighing 118 pounds, having lost nearly 40 pounds during captivity. Freeman became a structural engineer. He worked for 41 years for the New Hampshire Department of Transportation. Freeman designed or oversaw construction of bridges across the Merrimack and Connecticut rivers, reconstructed Highway 93 through 3 states, and designed the structural reinforcement for the Ashwelot Bridge that would serve communities for decades. The infrastructure Freeman designed outlasted his life by decades. When he died in 1997, obituaries noted his contributions to the public works of New England. His work shaped the physical landscape through which millions of vehicles traveled. The Ghost Army's deception enabled Freeman to return home, to contribute his engineering skills to American society, to shape the physical landscape through his professional work. Captain Edward Walsh, who survived Normandy and became a successful businessman, founded a manufacturing company that employed over 300 workers during its peak. His company produced precision machinery used in aerospace manufacturing. During the Apollo program, equipment manufactured by Walsh's company was installed in the lunar module that carried Apollo astronauts to the moon. Walsh's business success, which traced directly to his survival at Normandy through the grace of Operation Fortitude, contributed, however indirectly, to humanity's greatest technological achievement. Multiply these individual stories by tens of thousands. Each represents a life saved, a family created, a career that influenced others, a ripple effect extending forward through decades. The math is staggering. If each survivor influenced even 2 other people through their professional work, their family, their community involvement, then Operation Fortitude's impact extends to hundreds of thousands of people who would never have existed. The strategic calculation and its consequences. General Omar Bradley, who would later command 12 Army Group and become one of America's most distinguished military leaders, would reflect on Operation Fortitude in his memoirs. Bradley called it the single biggest hoax of the war. But he didn't mean it as criticism. He meant it as recognition of the operation's strategic significance and its human cost. By mid-June, the Normandy beachhead had expanded to incorporate approximately 20 miles of coastline. Over 326,000 troops had been landed by June 12th. Over 54,000 vehicles and more than 100,000 tons of supplies had been unloaded onto the beaches. The beachhead was expanding daily, and with each passing day, it became more secure against counterattack. But this exponential buildup would have been impossible if the 15th Army had struck from day one. If 150,000 German soldiers, equipped with artillery and armor, had counterattacked the vulnerable beachhead in the first critical days of the invasion, when the Allies had only light equipment ashore and hadn't yet established secure positions, the result could have been catastrophic. Historical analysis suggests that an immediate 15th Army counterattack would have compressed the beachhead, consolidated German defensive positions, and potentially pushed the Allies back toward the sea. The Allies would likely not have been driven completely off the beaches. American and British reinforcements were arriving continuously, and German forces lacked the reserves to eliminate the invaders. but the beachhead could have been confined to a narrow strip of territory while German forces attempted to destroy the invasion in its infancy. An alternative, more horrifying scenario would have involved attrition warfare in the beachhead. The Allies would have gradually reinforced the beachhead despite German opposition, but the casualties would have been exponentially higher. Instead of 10,500 Allied casualties on D-Day, the invasion might have incurred 50,000 to 100,000 casualties on the first day alone. The subsequent months of fighting to break out of a compressed beachhead against an intact German 15th Army would have resulted in casualty rates approaching those of static World War I campaigns. Instead, the 15th Army remained at Pas-de-Calais. This 6-week delay allowed the Allies to land enough force, establish enough secure positions, and prepare enough resources that even when the 15th Army finally arrived in late July, it made no meaningful strategic difference. The German reinforcements arrived too late to affect the outcome of the Normandy campaign. The deception planners' final accounting. For the men who had designed Operation Fortitude, the knowledge of how many lives their deception had saved created a peculiar mixture of satisfaction and moral weight. They understood that they had shaped the outcome of a military operation through psychological manipulation rather than military force. They had defeated an enemy not by killing his soldiers, but by making him unwilling to commit them to battle. Colonel David Strangeways, one of the chief architects of the deception campaign, would reflect on the operation's impact in private correspondence and interviews conducted after the war. He noted that Operation Fortitude represented a fundamental shift in military thinking, a recognition that controlling an enemy's decision-making was sometimes more valuable than conventional military operations. But Strangeways would never deliver classified lectures discussing the operation. He would die in 1968, taking most of his knowledge of Operation Fortitude's inner workings to his grave. The operation remained officially secret until the 1970s. Only then did historians and military strategists understand the full scope of what Strangeways and his team had accomplished. Instead, it was Colonel Roger Hesketh who compiled the classified history of Operation Fortitude after the war, who would later provide the most comprehensive accounting of the deception's impact. Hesketh understood that Operation Fortitude demonstrated a profound principle. An enemy could sometimes be defeated not through superior force, but through superior understanding of how that enemy's mind works. The paradox of psychological warfare. But Operation Fortitude also revealed something troubling about psychological warfare at the strategic level. The deception's success depended entirely on its victim's psychology, specifically Hitler's pathological distrust and the German High Command's collective willingness to believe intelligence assessments that suggested multiple threats rather than a single invasion. If Hitler had possessed a different psychological profile, if he had been less paranoid, less convinced that enemies were plotting elaborate conspiracies, less willing to believe that his intuitive understanding of strategy was superior to the advice of his commanders, the deception would have failed completely. The inflatable tanks and radio messages would have been penetrated. The intelligence consensus would have focused on Normandy as the real invasion. The 15th Army would have committed to counterattack. This raised a disturbing question for post-war military strategists. Could the same deception techniques that had worked against Hitler have worked against a different adversary? Would the Japanese military leadership have been as susceptible to the Phantom Army concept? Would Soviet commanders have been as easily manipulated? The analysis suggested the answer was no. The deception worked not because it was technically sophisticated, though it was, but because it exploited a specific enemy psychology. This realization led to a fundamental shift in military thinking about intelligence warfare in the post-war era. Deception wasn't simply about creating false evidence or constructing false appearances. It was about understanding the target's psychology, beliefs, decision-making processes, and cognitive biases. and then constructing false evidence that would systematically manipulate those psychological patterns. The deception worked because it was tailored to Hitler's specific paranoid psychology. A different leader with different psychological characteristics would have required a different deception. This meant that Operation Fortitude's success couldn't be simply replicated against other enemies. Each enemy required custom psychological analysis and custom-designed deception operations. The human cost and moral reckoning. But Operation Fortitude's success also carried a moral weight that its planners had to carry throughout their lives. The deception didn't eliminate casualties. It reduced them, but it didn't prevent them. Approximately 10,000 Allied soldiers still died on D-Day alone. Over 200,000 soldiers died in the subsequent months of combat to break out of Normandy and advance toward Germany. Tens of thousands more were wounded, some permanently disabled. The deception reduced casualties, but it didn't eliminate them. It bought time for the Allies to establish a secure beachhead, but it didn't prevent the months-long grinding campaign to break out of the Normandy Peninsula. Men died anyway, from shell fire, from small arms fire, from disease, from accidents, from simple bad luck. The Ghost Army had saved some lives, but it hadn't saved all lives. This distinction bothered some of the deception planners. They understood that their success in keeping the 15th Army at Pas-de-Calais had prevented certain deaths, but it hadn't prevented all deaths. In wars, the elimination of one form of death often simply created circumstances where different forms of death occurred. But the mathematics were clear. If Operation Fortitude prevented even 20,000 casualties, then for every casualty that still occurred, it saved one life. The ratio meant that without the deception, the number of dead would have been substantially higher. The final reckoning, yet when the Normandy campaign finally concluded, when the Allies broke out of the hedgerow country and into the open terrain of France, when the German army was defeated and the war in Europe was won, the calculation became clear. Operation Fortitude had contributed to an Allied victory that cost approximately 200,000 Allied lives in Western Europe during the war's final year. Without the deception, that number could have been significantly higher, potentially approaching 250,000 to 300,000 if the German 15th Army had committed to Normandy immediately after D-Day. The Ghost Army, the rubber tanks, the radio operators, the double agents, the psychological manipulation had shaped the outcome of one of history's most consequential military operations. The Allies had not conquered Normandy through the brilliance of tactical operations alone or the overwhelming firepower of military weapons. They had conquered Normandy by understanding their enemy's psychology and using that understanding to make the enemy defeat himself. In the years after the war, when historians and military strategists attempted to calculate Operation Fortitude's precise impact, they came to consensus on one point. The deception had saved thousands of lives. Conservative estimates suggested 30,000 additional casualties prevented. More generous estimates suggested 50,000 or higher. Each of these prevented casualties represented a human life saved, a family that would continue to exist, a legacy that would extend into future generations. The Ghost Army that fooled Hitler existed only in electromagnetic signals and the paranoid psychology of the German leadership, yet its impact was as concrete and measurable as any military victory. It shaped the outcome of an invasion, determined the course of a war, and preserved the lives of thousands of men who would have been killed if the deception had failed. Sergeant Collins's survival and legacy. Sergeant Collins, sitting in his foxhole in the bocage, didn't know about Operation Fortitude. He didn't know that his survival depended on a phantom army. He simply knew that he was alive, that his unit was holding, and that if they held long enough, they would eventually break out of the bocage and push toward Germany. Collins survived the Normandy campaign. He was promoted to sergeant and fought in subsequent European campaigns. He was decorated twice for bravery. He survived the war, returned to Nebraska, and married his high school sweetheart, Dorothy Carlson. They had 2 children, Robert Jr., who became a farmer like his father, and Susan, who became a nurse. Collins lived to age 88. His children grew up knowing him. His grandchildren knew him. His great-grandchildren know stories about him. Collins died peacefully in his sleep in 2010, surrounded by family. None of this would have happened if the German 15th Army had committed to Normandy. Collins's existence in the post-war world, his family, his descendants, all of this traces back to a ghost army that didn't exist, a deception that kept 150,000 German soldiers in the wrong place at the wrong time. The ghost army that changed everything was made of rubber and wood and radio waves and the precise understanding of how a paranoid mind works. It saved tens of thousands of lives. It shaped history. And most people who lived through the war never knew it existed. Most people alive today, descendants of men like Patterson, Riley, Freeman, Walsh, and Collins, live in a world that exists only because of a phantom army that lived only in the minds of deceived enemies. The rubber soldiers had won a victory more complete than any battlefield triumph could achieve. They had changed the course of history, and the world would never know their names.